Friday the 13th. Hate, Kill, Repeat. Chapter 14. Shock me! Sheriff Daniel Claymark had snatched the phone from its cradle and stood with it wedged against the side of his head. A handful of subordinates watched him nervously from their positions around the extensively wood-paneled station. He was horribly caffeinated and fully expecting more bad news. The day had started badly for this relatively young sheriff, with the discovery of the 2 police divers. Those murders had leaked out to media immediately, but the sheriff had done his damnedest to ensure that those 2 dead, very dead campers, Bobby Drimmer and Gina Levine, weren't announced. Not yet. So far, so good, on that score at least. Everything else was very bad. 2 hours ago, he had learned that Officer Hollis's vehicle had been found abandoned by a roadside over by the Flanahan farm. 2 further officers, Mahler and Kemp, had been sent to investigate the area. Mahler had radioed in, breathless and clearly in shock, as he quietly described the massacre that had taken place at the farmhouse. Much the same M.O. as the divers and the campers, in the sense that sharp objects and a great deal of ferocity had been involved. Then Mahler and Kemp checked on Chester Gray's cabin and found not only Gray himself, but also Hollis. Claymark was finding all of this hard to take in. When he took the job a mere 6 months ago, he never expected to have to deal with Jason Voorhees again, as the legendary Sheriff Garris once had. Of course, Garris had paid with his life, courtesy of a snapped spine. But Voorhees had supposedly wound up dead. Or was he? The killer that was stalking Crystal Lake was either someone appropriating Jason's methods, the big man himself, or the FBI's 2 puritanical butchers. Either way, Claymark might as well place an order for a new batch of body bags and tags. He could hardly believe what was happening, though there had been just a glint of good news this morning, as 2 children had been found at a campsite, their parents butchered, most likely in front of the children themselves, as the children were in extreme shock when the ambulance took them away. He would ask them later what they saw, but for now, the kids weren't talking. Though it did make him wonder if it was Jason indeed, because he remembered back when Jason had attacked the camp, but not hurt one single child that was there. That had been the same night that the older sheriff had been killed at Jason's hand, when his back was snapped. But thus far in his reign as sheriff, he had become accustomed to dealing with the occasional domestic, the odd robbery. Maybe a barroom brawl might pop up, every now and again, to distract him from his latest mug of coffee. Hell, he almost welcomed them. Given the number of kids who visited every summer, Crystal Lake wasn't the most challenging of districts to police. We found more dead campers, sir, said Mahler down the phone line, his distinctively lazy tones irritating Claymark as usual. Or, at least parts of dead campers. One guy's been burnt. Another one, well, we found only the head. We're going to continue to comb the area. More dead campers, sighed Claymark, his dry eyeballs flitting around the room at the grim faces. Love it! I fucking love it! The last 2 words were bellowed, accompanied by the crash of the handset striking the cradle. Claymark turned to his deputy, Ken Riger, a cold-eyed man who carried a pump-action shotgun around everywhere, as though expecting life-threatening conflict at any given moment. He called it the key, because it was useful for blowing stubborn doors open. Riger was engaged in a phone call of his own. Seeing that Claymark wanted his attention, Riger cut the call short and made obedient eye contact with the superior. Do we have that copter in the air yet, Ken? Riger nodded and smiled. It just went up, with the shooter on board. His eyes gleamed. I need you to keep in contact with those guys. Besides looking for Voorhees, or these Thawns, we have to evacuate any campers still in these woods. Riger nodded again. Sure. A man of few words, he looked quite happy, thought Claymark. Perhaps he was looking forward to using that shotgun again. There was a time when Claymark had suspected that Riger might use it on him, when he leapfrogged the old coot to get the sheriff's gig. After all, when you were deputy sheriff, where else was there to go? Claymark turned to his PA, Amy Bright. How's the search for, all the motels going? Are we keeping the FBI happy? Bright shrugged, exuding her usual indifference. Well, we're looking, alright? No Norwood or Penelope Thawn found yet, though. The pictures have circulated. And where are those wonderful FBI agents? They're conducting their own search. Great. Probably visiting the same places as us. Nice to see that they're so trusting in our efficiency. Bright shrugged again. Feeling his stress reach epidemic proportions, Claymark reached for the coffee jug once more. As she hurtled through open air, gravity sucking hungrily at her, Halo groped blindly with both hands, desperate for something. Anything. Behind her, she heard the cracking and groaning of the tree she had abandoned. Something struck her in the face, and her hand seized it. Finding bark and bough and leaves, she opened her eyes and found herself clinging to a new tree. She could hardly believe she'd made it. A tremendous eruption seemed to shake the woods. Halo realized it was her first tree's colossal weight hitting the earth. Determined not to look down, she concentrated on swinging herself toward the trunk, searching with her feet for a bough below. Nothing presented itself, so she made her way monkey-style along the heavy branch, sweat running into her eyes. Upon reaching the trunk, she allowed herself a whole minute to breathe, eyes closed. In through the nose and out through the mouth, all the time listening out for Jason, the fat crunch of his footsteps, the whistle of his machete through the air, most of all the thunk of the blade in her new tree's base. None of these sounds reached her. Finally, she opened her eyes, her heart slowing from a frantic techno pace to more of a strident tribal drum. Then she allowed herself to look down, at the wreckage of the tree which had fallen away from her. Where was Jason? He was nowhere to be seen. Halo blinked. Was she simply missing him? Was he standing there in the shadows looking up at her silently taunting? Narrowing her eyes and concentrating, she peered down. In the process of leaping to this tree, she had descended a few feet, so the ground was now a mere 10 feet below. If he was there, she should be able to spy him. Then movement, a slight shift in her field of vision. Where was it? She stared into the gloom until it happened again. Then she saw Jason. He was lying on his back directly beneath the fallen tree. It had landed along his body's length, very effectively pinning him down and resting on the right side of his head. The movement that Halo had detected was one of his fists. It was flexing, stretching, trying to reach something. She didn't need to see the glint of metal in order to deduce that it had to be his machete. Galvanized by this turning of tables, Halo began to make her steady way down the tree, every muscle and fiber aching from the exertion. When she neared the ground, she swung out on a bough, dangled for a second, then let herself drop the remaining distance with the limited grace she could muster. She had been planning to make good her escape, but a new thought seized her. Jason Voorhees was trapped. He was technically in her power. She could do anything to him. Thoughts of violence almost never came to Halo, but self-preservation was oiling the wheels. What if she ran away? But he simply managed to shift the tree and give chase once again. She was a stone's throw from him. At ground level, she could see his hand more clearly, opening, closing, reaching out. Halo walked slowly toward the spot where Jason lay. "Yes, Miss Bright, I know." Daimler threw a weary glance at Van Stat, while he continued to speak to the sheriff's PA. "You told me that you'd call if you found anything. I'm just calling to say that we've now checked all the motels. I think we need to turn our attention to the hotels. Maybe our perps have finally decided to spoil themselves and live the high life." While Bright repeated her mantra about the lack of police resources, after all, it seemed they already had one killer on the loose. Daimler sipped from a foam cup. "I understand. I've understood each and every time you've told me that stuff. That's why we're here, to help. We need to work together. Can you fax me a local hotel list, please?" He swiftly wound up the call and sighed. This Bright character was anything but her namesake. The agents had parked outside the Budget Inn, the last motel on the list. A steady stream of rundown vehicles drifted in and out of the small lot. "Shall we play Spot the Hooker while we drink our coffee?" said Daimler, never really expecting a response from his way too sensible colleague. He consulted his watch. 11. The night is still young. "You sobering up now?" Yes, thanks, Melissa. Didn't we drop the alcohol conversations, about 50 miles or so back? Stop drinking and I'll stop bitching about it, she offered, a mere hint of a smile playing along her lips. Oh, this is just way too much fun. The fax machine emitted a loud click and began to whir. He may have been rendered immobile, but Jason Voorhees was no less unnerving. Halo stood at what she trusted was a safe distance from his prone body. From this vantage point, she could discern his mask and most of his left side. As evinced by his active hand, he was still conscious, even though some of the tree's weight ensured that the left side of his head was flat against the dirt. Halo placed her hands on her knees, peering at the mask. Sure enough, that terrible eye was looking straight at her. Through her, it seemed. For a moment, she thought she heard a child's voice, somewhere inside her head, calling for her to help. Drowning. Halo knew it was Jason. With a shudder, she shrugged off those plaintive cries and scanned the surrounding area. It didn't take long to find what she was looking for. The machete was lying a few feet to her right, thankfully well out of Jason's reach. Halo moved over and grabbed the heavy wooden handle, wincing as she felt the slime that clung to it. Was this human gore? Pieces of his own flesh? She tried not to think about it. The point was she had the machete again and therefore the power. She swallowed hard, wondering what to do next. If she was really going to kill him, then how could it be achieved? She tried to remember what Trey had said about the British SAS aiming for vital arteries, but realized she had never listened to the poor guy's macho babbling. The thought of stabbing someone, even Jason Voorhees, made her feel faint. "Why?" she said, addressing him, having no idea how to finish the sentence. She finally settled for, "Why?" No answer arrived. Jason simply continued to watch her, with the steadily resentful gaze of an incarcerated lion, waiting for the right moment to strike or escape, she thought. But he couldn't, could he? That tree must weigh a ton. She felt a surge of hatred for this monstrosity. As his victims flashed through her mind, it struck her that she was in a position to stop the carnage for good, right here, right now. "I could kill you now," she murmured. "I could kill you." No answer, just that unblinking stare. Frustrated by his lack of response, Halo raised her voice. "Do you understand?" The terrified faces of dead people continued to parade before her mind's eye. Trey, Duke, Basket, Shona. All the other poor souls whose names she didn't even know. As though acting on their pleas for retribution, Halo tightened her grip on the long blade and took a step toward Jason. She positioned herself carefully, so that his vile claw could not reach her, no matter how hard it spasmed and shifted. Jason remained silent, even as the machete hovered by his mask, even as the razor-sharp end positioned itself inches from his right eye hole. The blade trembled almost imperceptibly. The child's voice returned to her head, louder this time, and far more effective in playing with her emotions. Like every man, this horrendous killer was once a small boy. Life had done this to him, turned his soul sour, hadn't it? Halo took a deep breath as tears rolled over her face. She knew that she could kill him, no matter what had happened to this man, in order to rot his soul so comprehensively. Yet the act was far beyond her ability. Killing simply wasn't in her DNA. It wasn't even a matter of murder being wrong, period. She just couldn't physically do it. Again, she tried thinking about Trey, Duke, poor Shona, and the others. But even this failed to spur her to end Jason's life. Haley Harlan was simply not the killing kind. As she pulled the blade away from Jason's face, he unleashed a low growl. His hand shot out, attempting to grab her ankle, but missed by a good measure. Halo stepped back as the whole tree juddered. It was a spasm of rage, unmistakable. She retreated again, still holding the machete. The tree shook again. This time she could see that Jason was writhing beneath it, trying to move that incredible weight. Halo suddenly wished she had killed him. Would her own sense of decency prove her undoing? There's still time, she thought. Step back in and finish it for everyone's sake. Another violent jolt made leaves rustle along the tree's length. Halo shook her head. As she did so, Jason became motionless and gripped her with his foul gaze. The child's voice was no more. It seemed he was done with the mind games. Right there and then she understood that he would stop at absolutely nothing in order to end her life. Him being pinned to the ground beneath a huge tree merely granted her a temporary stay of execution. As she swung on her heels and ran on hollow legs, Halo wondered why her mercy had so enraged him. Was it because he resented the power she had momentarily held over him? Or was it because some part of him wanted to die? Not really important, she told herself, the machete cutting effortlessly through the air as she gathered speed. One of her hips was killing her. Back over her shoulder, rumbles and crackles continued to denote Jason's systematic bids for freedom. It didn't take long for the realization to dawn. Even though she was running away from him, those sounds were getting louder. Eventually they stopped altogether. Had he given up, or was he free again? Halo tried not to think about it. "Why don't you just go home to your girlfriend, Kip? I don't want you hurling inside this goddamn car." Kip Mahler glanced ruefully over at the man he grudgingly referred to as his colleague. Lyle Kemp had been part of the sheriff's modest force for far longer and had obviously seen way more corpses. Either that or the bastard had no soul. Mahler's flesh felt loose and clammy on his bones, as though seeing all the death and devastation today had somehow transformed his physical makeup. He hadn't eaten since breakfast and didn't believe he would ever eat again. Having seen all that dead meat, hamburgers were sure off the menu. Yet none of it seemed to even scrape the surface for Kemp, the tough guy. He went about his duties with that stoic, tobacco-chewing calm, as though rescuing another cat from an old lady's tree. I'm not going home, Lyle. All this shit today has just sickened me, that's all. We can't all be robots like you, man." Kemp shot him an irritated look, his thick mustache bristling. "What's that supposed to mean?" Mahler let silence do the talking. He scanned the trees as they hummed along this dirt road. The same kind of road that Hollis had been patrolling, he realized. Hollis hadn't exactly been a friend of his. They were too busy competing for the next rung up the station ladder to socialize. But he had been a fellow police officer. What happened to Zeke could just as easily have happened to him. Still could, he reminded himself. That was about the only reason to be glad of Lyle's company. At least the man's unnaturally level-headed helped keep Mahler a few notches below the freak-out level. He drew in a deep breath and closed his eyes. "Holy shit!" yelled Kemp, stamping on the brakes. The vehicle came to a swift halt. Mahler's head jerked forward, the tip of his nose squashing against the glass of the windshield. What the hell was going on? This, Halo noted, was the second time a car had almost killed her that day. The shock of narrowly escaping death subsided, and she realized that she had found a car. A cop cruiser, in fact, with living, breathing cops inside of it. They would help her. Standing directly in front of the vehicle's grill, she could dimly see two silhouettes inside. "Help me!" "Oh my God," said Mahler, removing his nose from the glass. He told himself that if he survived this night, he would always wear a seatbelt. She's holding a fucking machete, Lyle." He turned to see Kemp coolly regarding the mad woman outside. Her mad eyes and hair, that bloodied face, the huge blade caked in red. "Looks that way," he said, leaning back in his seat and tugging his Colt .45 from its holster. Feeling very much the rabbit in headlights, Halo wondered why these cops weren't dashing to her assistance. Were they bloated with too many donuts? "Help me," she repeated, louder this time. Then she looked anxiously around her, scanning back along the thin path from which she had emerged. The driver's side clacked open. The first thing Halo saw was a gun, resting on the door's upper rim and pointing straight at her. Then two beady eyes behind it, a hint of a mustache. "Put that thing down," said Kemp. Halo was initially shocked by his cold, authoritative tone, then remembered the machete. She lowered it. Those beady eyes rose, peering over the car hood. "Drop it, ma'am. Let go of the handle." "Listen," stuttered Halo. "There's a killer after me. I think it's Jason Voorhees. He could be right." Kemp's voice hardened. "I said drop it. Do it now, or I'll blow your goddamn skull wide open." Halo bit her lip. She regretfully released the handle and heard the weapon strike the ground. Content with this, Kemp stamped around the car door. Halo didn't like the look of him. but at least he was a man of strength. "Please," she said, "we should get out of here. It's Jason Voorhees." "I'm sure it is." The tone was warmer now, but patronizing. "I'm Officer Kemp. Tell me who you are." "I'm Haley Harlan. Listen, I met 2 more killers by the lake. I think that..." Her voice faltered. "I think that one of them might have murdered my sister. Can we go to Phoenix Heights Hotel, please?" Kemp didn't respond to the request. He simply walked over to Halo, placing an uncaring hand on her back, and firmly guided her around to the car's left-hand rear door. "Let's just get you to the sheriff's office, miss. There's plenty time for other concerns." Halfway into the car, Halo froze angrily. "She's my sister, Shelley Harlan. I need to know if she's okay." "First, we need to ask you some questions. Establish who you are." Halo sighed and heaved herself inside the car. There was no part of her which didn't ache, heart included. The younger, kinder-faced cop smiled her way. How you doing, ma'am?" Halo flinched as the car door slammed shut beside her. Looking out of the window, she saw Kemp pulling on a pair of surgical-style gloves. "For fingerprints," Mahler informed her, sounding for all the world like a kid playing at being a cop. "Mine'll be all over the handle," said Halo, her dread and irritation mounting. "That's pretty obvious, but it belongs to him." Mahler's face darkened. Him? You mean..." Halo nodded grimly. Kemp stood at the front of the car, bathed in the headlights. He bent down, partly out of view, then he came up frowning. Mahler frowned back at him through the windshield. "Jason Voorhees," said Halo pointedly. "Can we get going, please?" Mahler was still staring at his partner. Kemp spread his hands as though confused. He opened his mouth. "Hey, Kemp, I can't find the damn..." Then his mouth wasn't there anymore. Neither was his head. Halo shrieked so loudly she could have sworn that something snapped in her throat. Mahler just sat there goggling at the jet of blood that was spurting from his colleague's neck stump, spraying the windshield like rain. For a surreal moment, the body remained standing like a puppet, swaying gently. Then the knees buckled and it fell out of view. Jason Voorhees stepped into Kemp's place, like an actor taking his mark on a floodlit stage. In the headlights' glare, he glowered with a new intensity. He was once again clutching the machete. To Halo's dismay, Mahler had frozen rigid. He seemed to think that Jason operated on the shark principle. Don't move and he won't attack. "Drive the fucking car!" she yelled, her mouth inches from her cop's ears. Her left hand found the door handle. Mahler looked over at the driver's seat, still dazed. Then he snapped out of his fugue. Scrambling over the gear stick and dropping into position, his hands reached out for the ignition. "Fuck!" he said, his voice rising an octave. "Keys! Out there in Lyle's pockets!" Outside, Jason was bending down in front of the cruiser. "Let's get out and run!" yelled Halo, amazed that she was now calling the shots. What kind of cop was this guy? "Go!" The world outside the car shifted dramatically. Halo felt her center of gravity moving and quickly realized that it was the vehicle, not the surroundings, which were tilting. She peered out through the gore-splattered windshield to see that the hood was rising up Jason's body. "Oh, God!" said Mahler, his voice now female operatic. "He's gonna flip us!" Halo frantically twisted her car door handle and felt the exit pop open an inch. Then everything spun around. Jason rose stiffly to his full height, bringing the cruiser up with him. He watched, entranced, as the metal box swung into the air, slowly becoming a vertical structure, resting on its back bumper. Screams issued from within, like kids on a fairground ride. Momentum did the rest. The police car teetered, then continued to tumble backwards. It landed on its roof with a savage rending of metal and glass. Jason waited for the screams to continue. None came. My Life, Part 3, Seeking Redemption. I obviously have no idea what kind of impression you've formed of me thus far. Diaries are very much a one-way medium. I guess that when my actions come to light, they will speak for themselves, and these diaries will no doubt be discovered, maybe published. But I'm no serial killer. Hey, I'm not stupid. I don't want to go to prison. Who's going to spread the good word if I'm behind bars? I'm just a person with certain beliefs, who will act on them when the opportunity presents itself. Yes, that's it. I'm a creature of opportunity. I'm also a redeemer. Yes, that's with a capital R. You see, there is more than one of us. I discovered this when I moved to the Big Smoke. If you move in the right circles, you'll eventually find like-minded souls. That's how I met Levin. Never knew whether that was her first name or second. Didn't really care, to tell you the truth. We more importantly shared an outlook on life. Number one, there were rules. Number two, certain people had no regard for these rules. Number three, certain people needed to learn the hard way. To look at her, you'd never know that Levin was so hardcore. She was a mousy little thing in her mid-20s, so delicately structured that you'd swear a good gust of wind might carry her clean away. She never seemed to eat, but we both enjoyed the odd beer. My father used to disapprove of my mother's drinking, but this was one of the few areas in which he and I disagreed. I didn't see alcohol itself as a sinful substance. It was overdoing it that deserved punishment. Levin and I originally met in some bar or other, both reading books about morality, getting to talking and swapping notes. I never felt attracted to her, and sincerely hoped the feeling was mutual. One fateful Friday in Rotalo's bar downtown, Levin sank more beer than usual. We both did, but I was born with the ability to remain pretty sharp, no matter how much I drank. It was a blustery winter's night, with empty tables outnumbering the patrons. Out on the street, a stray newspaper sheet billowed around, controlled by the gale's fickle whims. We had been talking about forms of worship for a while. I had been arguing that personal beliefs were enough, and that you didn't need church or a community. Levin disagreed, quietly at first, then with added liquor quite vociferously. You don't know what she corrected herself, what I have. My ears pricked at this. I was curious. What do you mean we? Do you attend a group? Levin smiled and shook her head, then fidgeted with one side of her wooden beanie hat, as she always did when agitated. She glanced awkwardly over at the neon restroom sign and started to shift in her seat. I'll be right back, she had said. Another beer? I quickly reached out and covered her spindly hand with my own. My tone was firm. Don't avoid the question. What did you mean? Levin tried to pull her hand away, but I exerted the grip, hurting her ever so slightly. She winced and looked at me imploringly. I can't. Just forget about it, okay? She said. Never having had a talent for forgetting, I flat out refused to do so. Over the next half hour, I refused to let Levin and her supposedly full bladder leave the table. I mentally bludgeoned her until the whole truth seeped out. The heavy trapdoor was tugged open for me, revealing a metal ladder, which descended out of sight. This was it. I was finally about to attend a gathering of the Redeemers. For some time now, I had been positive that an underground movement existed somewhere in America. People with similar ideas to myself. Surely Levin and I couldn't be the only ones with the right view of morality. My path to the Redeemer's secret chambers, since that night in Rotalo's, had been long and winding. For 2 months, Levin would report back on her progress toward getting me in. They weren't accepting any new members, she repeatedly told me. I repeatedly told her to keep trying. Levin had given me a sketch outline of this clandestine sect. They were like-minded souls. People believed in standards, but were far from being armchair moralists. No, the Redeemers would take very direct action from time to time. All members were sworn to absolute secrecy. If their behavior in the world at large led to their arrest, they would expose the sect at their own peril. One member, Levin believed, had led the authorities to one of the high priests, who had committed suicide upon their arrival. The loudmouth traitor was subsequently bludgeoned to death in prison by an inmate who had been financially compensated by a mysterious third party. All in all, it was just my kind of club. Some people drift through life, turning a blind eye to the wretched life choices made by others. They choose to ignore the evils that men and women do, because it's so much easier. Not me. I intend to make a big difference with my life. That's why I persisted for so long, until finally Levin came back bright-eyed, carrying the news that I had finally gained the Redeemer's trust. I could attend a gathering of the Redeemers in a week's time. I wouldn't be allowed to access to all of the chambers in use at this soiree, but I didn't care. There would be time for that later. So there I was, gazing down that trapdoor, imagining what might lay below. Levin stood beside me along with Mr. Buenos, the owner of the restaurant. He was clearly sympathetic to the Redeemer's cause, as they held regular meetings beneath his establishment. Either that or he took the money and couldn't care less what they were doing down there. Levin and I had showed Buenos our ID, amethyst stones and black cords around our necks, and he had opened the portal. I gestured for Levin to go first. For some reason my heart was fluttering about my chest like a sparrow. Then I followed her down into the darkness. When he was sure my head was safely out of the way, Mr. Buenos wedged the trapdoor back into place. Chapter 15. Tom had never seen Greg looking quite this drunk. The man had been knocking back the firewater all evening, as though the bar closed at regular hours and Intrax's celebrations wouldn't stretch on through the night. He was red in the face and swaying around the room, slapping people's backs. Tom was quite drunk himself, having lost track of the number of beers he'd consumed in this lounge. It had been a long night, and he felt beat. He would hit his bed early, if the promised Intrax festivities didn't commence by midnight. Tom took another look at Greg and groaned. The man was making his way across the room toward him and April. As he moved, he held the backs of chairs like crutches. He locked eyes with Tom like a bull seeing a red rag. "Oh, please, please get rid of him," said April, clearly inebriated herself, if her distorted speech was any indication. "He's putting a real crimp on my night." Tom sighed heavily as his new nemesis drew closer. Perhaps, he thought, he could feign a coronary, or maybe a real one was on the cards. Halo was woken by moaning. It dragged her back to consciousness out of the thick, moist cotton wool which seemed to fill her skull. She had no idea where she was, but it wasn't good. The moaning, what was it? She opened her eyes and saw her own legs crunched up below her. No, they were above her. She was upside down. Then it all came flooding back. Oh God, she thought. I'm in the police car. Jason flipped it. The weight of my own body is pushing my head down like this. It's full of blood. And that moaning is coming from the cop in the driver's seat. Moving her head from side to side, the neck was so sore. Halo saw shards of broken glass lying on what had been the inside of the roof. Both the side windows had been broken in, their metal frames buckling in the process, narrowing what might have otherwise been viable gaps to crawl out through. Halo felt a stab of anxiety as she realized that the doors probably wouldn't open either. She had at least been fortunate that the roof had been strong enough to resist being entirely crushed. Otherwise, her spine might have snapped like a twig. We've got to get out," the murmur came from the cop, who seemed semi-conscious. Gazing past her own contorted body, Halo could see his head, bent to one side against the roof, or the floor as it had become. She shushed Mahler, and he fell silent. Please, God, thought Halo, let Jason assume that we're both dead. Let him stalk off into the distance and live unhappily ever after. Let him... "Get me out of here," Mahler said. "I don't want to die. I have a girlfriend, a mom, a dad." Halo surprised herself by becoming riled. There was something about this guy's rampant self-pity that provoked her. "If you want to get out of here, then shut the fuck up," she said, her voice sharp as steel, aware that the aggression was so unlike her. It angered her to think that Jason Voorhees could do this to people, not only tear them apart physically, but distort their personalities. She hated that bastard beyond anything in the world. The cop persisted in his freaking out. I can smell gas, you dumb cunt! The whole fucking car could blow!" Halo hadn't noticed the reek, but it seemed horribly plain. Somewhere behind her head, she could also hear a slow, steady drip. As Halo focused on escape, the cop continued to babble, still at an unwise volume. "We'd be fine if it hadn't been for you running out of the goddamn woods. Jesus fucking Christ, I'm not ready to die." Halo gingerly cradled the door handle in her palm. It resisted movement, remaining stiff. Even as her heart sank, Halo remembered. Just before Jason had turned them over, the door had popped open. Abandoning the handle, she placed her flat palm on the door itself and shoved. Something cracked along the length of her arm, making her grimace. The door grudgingly admitted an inch of weak light, indirectly provided by the cruiser's headlamps, which were still on. "Is your door open?" asked Mahler. "Mine won't move. You've got to get me out of here." "I won't help you unless you're quiet," said Halo. Knowing that she was bluffing, she would be compelled to rescue him, even if he assembled a Philharmonic orchestra inside this damn death trap. "I've had enough of being told what to do," he blurted. "You open my fucking door right now. I've got a gun in here and I'll shoot you, I swear to God." Trying her best to ignore him, Halo shoved at her own door again. It opened wider. Her smile faded as it slammed shut again, a pair of horribly familiar feet becoming visible, out through the ruined window. Big, black, flecked with the blood of innocence. Halo's stomach danced. "What are you doing?" yelled Mahler, unable to see that Jason had returned. This, she thought, was a small mercy. Jason's feet moved away along the car. Halo twisted her head slightly and saw that he had stopped by Mahler's window. Oh no, she had to tell him. "Jason's right outside your window. Use the gun." Then she watched, a captive audience, as Jason's bony knees landed heavily beside the vehicle, one by one, along with the dull flash of steel. Mahler wailed. He was writhing in his cramped space, struggling to grab his firearm. Jason slid the machete blade through the open window, positioning it across Mahler's throat. The cop's wail rose in volume and pitch. Halo began to hyperventilate, feeling wholly unable to stop herself. Her whole life had spun out of control, and death was laughing in her face, too. Mahler's histrionics were cut short by an unspeakable gurgle. It intensified as Jason drew the machete back and forth as though sawing wood. Halo closed her eyes and desperately concentrated on regaining her breath. The gurgling ceased. A tiny part of Halo's mind, a part she didn't like to believe existed, spoke up. Silence at last. She twisted her legs around on the ceiling, attempting to change her position. At the moment, her head was dangerously close to the window. Jason's hand shot into the car and grabbed her throat. With the speed of 2 consecutive frames of film, Halo sputtered and choked, fully expecting to die in seconds. The hand around her throat was ice cold. There was no doubt that Jason Voorhees was dead. He had been worm food for decades and reeked accordingly. So why wasn't she dead yet? The grip, she realized, was only tight enough to hold her in place, staring at the makeshift roof of her cage. It wasn't even interrupting the oxygen flow to her brain. Then she was being moved like a doll, her head slowly twisted to the left by that gelatinous fist. Was he going to break her neck? She knew it would rupture like a twig in his grasp. No, he was turning her to look at him. Jason's mask filled the buckled window frame. She was tempted to close her eyes, but decided she may as well suck in all the sights this grim world had left for her. Halo had a full view of his rancid, deformed eye socket. The man-child. Yes, this was him, all right. This was the first opportunity she'd had to examine him up close and personal, albeit fully involuntarily, and she saw a child consumed by hatred and vengeance. That explained why she wasn't dead yet. She knew, feeling sick to her soul. Earlier, she had wielded absolute power over Jason. He had been helpless, at the end of his own blade. Payback would be a bitch. When the machete's tip appeared in the window frame, alongside Jason's head, it came as no surprise. What Halo said next surprised her greatly. "Bring it on, you sack of pus," she croaked. "An eye for an eye." The obscene metal edged inside the vehicle. She could have sworn Jason was smiling behind that goddamn mask. The thought angered her. If she was going to die by this bastard's hand, she wanted to know that she had at least scarred him somewhere deep inside. She drew her lips back over her teeth. "Bring it on, motherfucker. And I bet you did fuck your mother, didn't you? That's why you're so fucked in the head." Jason's grip tightened on her throat. The machete drew closer, only inches away. "You was so busy fucking your mother, in fact, that you forgot to take swimming lessons, huh?" The machete twisted as though Jason was ensuring it was on a direct collision course with one of her eyeballs. Halo squirmed against his grip, but it was sheer iron, and tighter, cutting off her air. Halo only hoped that she would black out before the blade did its work. "Vengeance shall be mine," Norwood Thawn repeatedly muttered this phrase while charging through the woods, his shirt drenched with blood and sweat. His once sculptured hair was a wild, random mop. The makeshift bone knife jutted out of his right hand, like an extension of his person. He was swiftly tracing his and Penelope's steps back to the hotel. Here, he planned to regain their Pontiac and use it to hunt down that unholy wretch Voorhees. Having said that, he was also open to the possibility of stealing the first automobile to cross his path. To think that he and Penelope, oh, sweet dear Penelope, had placed so much trust in Jason. Norwood had questioned Penelope's faith, but she was generally right in such matters, and he had been loath to stand in the way of her wishes. Poor sweet Penelope. She reached out to what she thought was a fellow believer and was crushed. Jason Voorhees was a wolf in wolf's clothing, after all. "Vengeance shall be mine," Thawns snarled again, as the wind whipped into his face. As the trees around him thinned, he saw headlamps lighting up a small road which crossed through the woods up ahead. Grinning maniacally, he attempted to restore his persona. Could he ever become the deceptively charming Norwood Thawn of old? Probably not, he realized, not less than an hour after his beloved wife had been butchered like some base animal. With this in mind, he decided to play the very genuine role of grieving husband. Norwood tucked the knife inside his pocket. Then he stumbled onto the roadside and waved his arms. It occurred to him that he hadn't waited to see whether this was a police car, as the headlamps considerately dimmed. He was relieved to see that it was not. The wheels slowed rapidly, plowing through the dirt beside him, then coming to rest. Norwood looked suitably devastated. It came naturally to him. The vehicle's passenger window rolled down. A hand emerged, clutching a semi-automatic pistol. "Hey there, Norwood," smirked Ed Daimler, leveling the gun at Thawns' chest. "Where's the wife?" When the shot sang out like some blissful angel, Jason's machete was about to burst Halo Harlan's left eyeball. Instead, the blade jerked to one side, scratching her left cheek with its very tip. Halo could smell gunpowder, the same kind she'd smelt back in the log cabin, and knew Jason had been hit by a shotgun blast. Machete and mask vanished from the window as Jason stood up. He walked away. Drip, drip, the splash of gasoline. Suddenly, this mysterious cavalry didn't seem quite so beautiful. If a shot hit the vehicle, she'd quickly meet her maker. Seeing no reason to hesitate again, she twisted herself around, ignoring all pain which ensued from protesting limbs, so that her feet touched that left-hand door. With all her might, she slammed both heels against it. The door flew open hard. Outside, Halo could hear someone yelling at Jason, their southern twang evident. "Now you stay right there, son. I don't know what you're doing with that cruiser, but I don't like the look of you one bit." Halo began to drag herself out through the doorway. "Stop right there, I said," the voice continued, "or I'll shoot to kill." Don't miss, thought Halo. Please don't miss and hit the car. She scrabbled at metal, plastic, and anything else that gave her a hold. "I said stop!" The shotgun fired again. The car didn't explode, but it did shake violently, absorbing some kind of impact. Finally, scrabbling free, Halo saw that Jason had been struck by the blast, staggered back, and lay sprawled across the car's upended rear bumper. Beyond him, in front of a small pickup truck, stood a handsome old man with young eyes and long white hair. He looked like some kind of country singer. He was looking at her imploringly. "I had to do it. He wouldn't stop walking like I told him." Halo cupped her hands over her mouth like a loud hailer. "He's not dead yet. Shoot the car." Even as she spoke, Jason was stirring, raising himself off the bumper. The newcomer set about reloading the weapon, snapping it in half and fumbling with a cartridge. He cursed under his breath. "Quickly," she urged, "before he—" At the sound of her voice, Jason's head swung to face her. The blast appeared to have struck his chest, removing a chunk of his masked chin portion and revealing some of his jagged teeth. Despite appearing to be a mess of bullet hits, burn damage, and other miscellaneous wounds, he was frighteningly steady on his feet. The old man clunked the weapon back together and hurriedly took aim. Jason walked away from the police car. Halo ran toward the trees and launched herself into a dive. The old man fired. The blast gunned into the cruiser's exposed underside, hitting the gas tank. The police car tore apart, a fiercely expanding ball of light, heat, and thunder. Fire lashed out in all directions, and pieces of metal showered the surrounding area, hammering into the old man's pickup, the road, and the trees on either side of it. Churning black smoke mushroomed. Halo landed heavily on one side of the road, clumsily attempting to adopt the fetal position. Flame lashed her legs, and she cried out. Scurrying further away from the road, she rolled down a slope amidst dirt and leaves. The blast had subsided, but the fire raged on. Halo wanted to lie down there in the relative safety of the trees, but was afraid to. The last she had seen, Jason was standing right next to the car when it blew, but she wasn't sure exactly what it took to dispose of him. As she unsteadily righted herself, it struck her that she might be on fire, and she frantically patted her legs, back and front. Her jeans had blackened, but the skin below felt okay. She'd live for now. What about the old man? Halo dearly hoped that he had survived the blast. She took a deep breath and began to make her way back up the gentle slope. Deputy Reiger's chair creaked in protest as he swung around in it. He jabbed a positive thumb in the air, cradling the receiver under his numerous chins. He reported to Sheriff Claymark. "Those feds have found one of their killers, Sheriff. He was running around in the woods. They just ran into him." Claymark raised an eyebrow and nodded. "Swell. That's one good thing today at least. They gonna bring him in?" Reiger addressed the phone. "You gonna bring him in?" Reiger nodded vigorously at the sheriff. "Okay," said Claymark, to no one in particular. "Make sure our finest cell is ready. We have a distinguished guest on the way." "See you shortly." Melissa Van Stat deactivated the phone, careful to keep her concentration on the road. Beside her, Ed Daimler had his gun trained on Norwood Thawn's perspiring face. Thawn was still, panting as though having completed the marathon. Both his hands were cuffed to a metal pole, which ran behind the back seat, making him sit awkwardly. "So, I'll ask you again," said Daimler. "Where's Penelope?" While Daimler was concerned about Penelope still being on the loose, the simple act of apprehending Norwood had sent joy coursing around his system. As always, it was way better than any drink or drug. Sadly, this feeling wasn't readily available in pharmacies, bars, or even crack houses. You had to track down and apprehend a felon on America's Most Wanted list in order to experience this high. "I think," said Norwood, attempting to regain some composure, "that you better save that interview for whichever shithill station you're taking me to, with a damn good attorney present." "Mr. Thawn," said Van Stat, "I think you'd better find yourself a miracle worker. You were carrying a knife made from human bone, and you're covered in blood. I'll wager that none of it belongs to you either." At this, Norwood's eyes misted over. "No," he said sadly, "it doesn't." His bottom lip began to tremble, and he averted his face from Van Stat. When his sobbing began, the two agents stole a curious look at each other. This wasn't quite what they had anticipated. Okay, this has been chapters 14 and 15 of Friday the 13th, Hate, Kill, Repeat. I'm glad to be back. Took a day off yesterday. Voice feeling a lot better today. A little cracky here and there, but nothing like it was. I'm enjoying this story. Hope you guys are. Looks like what I was mad about last upload of this book. Don't have to be mad about that anymore. Apparently Jason didn't kill the kids. So there's that. Alright guys, thanks for listening. I'll see you in the next upload. I'll be back tomorrow when I do the conclusion of Jason X Planet of the Beast. And the day after that, we'll get some more of Hate, Kill, Repeat going. Till next time, this has been your friendly neighborhood 80s slasher librarian saying, thanks for listening, And don't click that thumbs down, because...
It's got a death curse!